We're now being joined by Johnson Chukwu. He is the CEO of Carry Assets Management Limited. Good morning.
Good morning.
For coming on the program. Our focus today has to do with achieving a medium-term fiscal framework. We saw what the president tried to do just last week or thereabout, going to the National Assembly to tell them that, okay, for the 2013 fiscal year, we will be spending 4.9 trillion naira. Okay, that seems to be an increase from what we used to have before. But what's your take about this figure?
Well, the most important thing about the figure, the medium-term fiscal framework, is that we're moving gradually away from dominance of recurrent expenditure to a better share of capital expenditure in the expense profile of the federal government. If you look at that, what the president said to the Senate, the share of capital expenditure in federal government expenditure profile for 2013 will be 31.34%. That's an improvement from the 28.74% we had for 2012. And we also saw that the government actually whittling down on the presence of overhead expenditure in the expense profile of the federal government. 2010, the overhead expenditure was 536 billion. As of 2012, we had dropped to 266 billion. The fiscal framework that the president submitted to the Senate also showed that it's going to drop to 230 billion, which is going to be about 4.67% of the national budget by 2014. So we are seeing a gradual improvement in the share of capital expenditure in the expense profile of the federal government, which is what all of us have been saying. There is no point where capital expenditure accounted for less than 25% of the total expense of the country. There's no way, given our infrastructural gap, that we can develop if we don't have a better share of capital expenditure in the expense profile of the federal government.
Okay, it could be laudable to say that capital votes will be up to 31%. But do you think that we'll be able to achieve our set target for 2013, at least we're looking at 2013, based on this upscale?
Well, I will look at it from what we have done so far this year. The latest report from the Federal Ministry of Finance shows that the federal government releases of capital expenditure after the 1.3 trillion that the government has released, about 700 billion, and of which they say the cash backing is about 536 billion. That shows a significant improvement from what we used to have in previous years. If that is a basis to look at what should happen next year, and given that the budget is due to be presented to the Senate on October 4th, so all things being equal, the budget for 2003 should be approved before the end of the year, which means implementation should start from January 1st or January 2nd, because January 1st in Nigeria is always a public holiday. If implementation starts by beginning of January, we should have a better performance in terms of implementation of the federal budget. Today, we are in terms of releases of about 700 billion, we are talking about something close to about 50% of the capital expenditure being released. But remember that the budget implementation started in April and not January, because it took some time for the budget to be approved. So if we have an earlier approval, and given the traction that the current Minister of Health has actually achieved in terms of budget implementation, we should actually we should imagine that we should achieve better implementation in 2013.
Do you think we'll be able to meet our set target for this year if our budget implementation for 2012 started in April? Do you think all the projections and the various infrastructure that we want to develop for this year will be developed?
Well, yeah, that's why I said if you look at what they have achieved so far, I mean, in terms of months of implementation, if you count from the month of April, this is the month of September, we have had something like 5 months of implementation. So, and we are close to 50% implementation of the total capital budget. So if you use that as a parameter, then it simply means if you take the time backward and go back to something like, assume that the budget was started in January, probably we should be talking of close to 80-90% implementation. I think in terms of, partly because the National Assembly has put a lot of pressure on the executive to make sure that they implement the budget. If that subsists, I think we should achieve a reasonable, something close to 80% budget implementation. But let me also tell you, it's all rare anywhere in the world to have 100% budget implementation, because the budget is actually a projection. And reality differs from projections. So when realities differ, when realities hit home, you find out that there have to be adjustments here and there. And I don't know of any country that can actually achieve 100% budget implementation.
But a number of times, Nigerians have not really been able to implement this budget. Maybe not up to 100%.
We've done something like 30%, 40% in the past. I mean,
in a year.
Yeah, previously it was very bad. It was very bad previously. I mean, what we've done now, what we've achieved so far, should be one of the best we have seen in recent times, so far. But I also think the level of awareness among Nigerians is also increasing. Nigerians are demanding for good governance. The National Assembly is also putting a lot of pressure on the executive to implement the budget. Because there's no point reeling out figures every year in, year out. And then at the end of the year, you don't see manifest improvement in infrastructure base based on what those things contain in the budget.
Okay, one thing that maybe the Ministry of Finance will have to do for Nigerians is let us know how these monies are spent, because especially when it comes to allocation to state governments, there's been question about how do they expend these funds? What are those things that have been earmarked and how were they executed? Perhaps, or what do you think? Do you think the Federal Ministry of Finance and all the relevant bodies involved in collation of data and having to track government activities, able to let us know how these funds, perhaps, because you talked about good governance, maybe that would help us to appreciate them if we do not really know how they go about doing their business.
You see, there are several things that I put in place to ensure that executives execute budgets. You have the Fiscal Responsibility Bill, but the fact is that the Federal Minister of Finance or the Federal Minister of Finance is not in a position to monitor or compare.
But there are relevant bodies who do that, who keep track.
You see, you have three arms of government. You have the federal government, the state government, and the local government. Each of them is semi-autonomous. The state governments are autonomous in terms of their expenditure profile from the federal government. The states have state assemblies. It is the duty of the state assemblies to carry out oversight functions on projects earmarked by the executive government, executive arm of government for implementation and capturing the state budget for which funds have been disbursed. It is not the duty of the Federal Minister of Finance or any other federal minister for that matter to monitor budget implementations at the state levels. So the key thing is that we must strengthen the legislature at the state levels. I mean, there was a time during the last constitutional amendment when part of the constitutional amendment that was rejected by the state legislators was to make them independent of the state executives. But interestingly, because the state executive seems to have kind of overriding power over the legislatures in most states are not independent enough to monitor or to carry out oversight function of what the state governments are doing. I hope the current ongoing constitutional amendment will reflect that, so that once the state legislatures are independent, they can now query what the states are doing, which is different from what you have at the federal level. The federal legislature is a self-accounting unit or arm of the government, so they don't wait for handouts from the Federal Executive Council, and therefore they are in positions to carry out oversight function on what the Federal Executive Council is doing. And that's why recently they say they want to go on visitations to go and carry out visitation of all the ongoing projects to determine that Nigerians are getting good value for the money being spent on those projects. That's part of the role of the legislature. But at the state levels, those are very weak. You don't have vibrant, independent state legislatures that can actually monitor and break down the neck of the state executive. In most instances, you actually find out that the state executive has actually pocketed the legislature. So they have a field there.